In ancient records, there's a boundary that no one discusses. Prior to this line, rulers hold power for 30,000 years each time. Following it, they exist and perish like regular men. Prior to this line, kingship comes down from heaven. Following it, humans rule themselves. The Sumerian king list, a clay prism located in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, indicates this boundary with one phrase etched in wedge-shaped script. Then the flood swept over. What comes after that sentence represents history that's recognizably human, with kings having believable lifespans, cities we've dug up, and names appearing in other ancient documents. But what precedes the flood outlines something completely different. If you like delving into the enigmas concealed within ancient texts, press that like button and subscribe. Share in the comments your location and the current time there. And as usual, the visuals provide context. But the true proof lies in the texts themselves, housed in museums, ready to be interpreted in new ways. Let's look at what the most ancient historical documents really state. In 1906, Hermann Hillrecht, a German-American scholar, released his translation of a cuneiform tablet that had been collecting dust in museum storage. It was known as the Weld-Blundell Prism, unearthed from the ruins of Larsa in southern Iraq, and it held what experts now term the Sumerian king list. The prism is compact, roughly 8 inches high, crafted from baked clay, inscribed on all 4 faces with small wedge marks impressed into damp clay more than 4,000 years ago. It's not a myth. It's not verse. It comes across like an official record, a register. The sort of file a court scribe would keep to monitor succession and authority. It starts with a declaration that seems nearly offhand in its vastness. After kingship came down from heaven, the kingship resided in Eridu. Then it enumerates rulers. Each record uses the identical structure: name, city, duration of rule. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alalga of Eridu, 36,000 years. Enmen Luana of Bad Tibira, 43,200 years. The scribe proceeds through 8 kings spanning 5 cities. No remarks, no clarifications. Just names and figures noted with the same clerical accuracy applied to grain stocks and property assessments. The sum meticulously calculated at 241,200 years, and then without formality or expansion, the list declares, then the flood swept over. Here's what renders this document hard to ignore. After that statement about the flood, the king list keeps going. New kings, new cities, new dynasties. But now the figures alter. Rulers after the flood hold power for 600 years, then 400, then 126, then 90. The reigns diminish quickly until they attain lengths historians deem realistic, the sort of lifespans real people could experience. And then the list accomplishes something that alters everything. It mentions Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, whose rule the king list notes as 126 years. Gilgamesh, whose epic poem stands as one of the oldest surviving literary works of humankind. Gilgamesh, whose city walls have been physically uncovered by archaeologists. Gilgamesh existed. The Sumerian king list positions him in the same text, composed by the same scribes employing the same official tone as the kings who allegedly governed for 40,000 years. This poses an issue that conventional archaeology has never adequately addressed. If the latter portion of the king list is regarded as valid history, and it is since we can confirm its later rulers via separate sources, then why do we instinctively reject the initial portion as complete imagination? The same scribe authored both parts. The same layout pertains to both. The document draws no line between the legendary and the factual. It offers them as one unbroken timeline, disrupted solely by a flood. To embrace half and discard half isn't academic rigor. It's selecting which proof to disregard. The extraordinarily long reigns aren't haphazard. They adhere to an exact mathematical scheme rooted in the Sumerian sexagesimal base 60 numeral system. the same framework that provided us with 60 seconds and 60-minute hours. The Sumerians' biggest time measure was termed a sar, signifying 3,600 years. Examine the reigns once more. Alulim, 28,800 years. It's 8 sar. Alalga, 36,000 years. It was 10 Saudi riyals. Enmenluana, 43,200 years. It was 12 Saudi riyals. Every pre-flood reign is a precise multiple of 3,600. This isn't the creation of narrators fabricating grand-sounding figures. This is methodical, computed, the type of accuracy you'd anticipate from a society that devised the earliest written bookkeeping methods and created astronomical diagrams precise enough to monitor Venus's orbits. The scribes were documenting something they perceived as structured, ordered, and authentic. But what? Two options arise, and neither is easy. The first, these figures symbolize eras, dynasties, or celestial cycles condensed into the rules of single rulers. But if that's the case, why not declare it? Why present them as individual kingships with particular names linked? The second option is more disturbing. The king list's opening provides the context, after the kingship descended from heaven. For the Sumerians, rulership wasn't something humans created. It wasn't an organic development from early groups through experimentation and mistakes. It was something bestowed, an establishment delivered to earth from elsewhere. Here's what the king list omits. Where did the kingship proceed after the flood? The text notes that it kept passing from city to city, dynasty to dynasty, but it never descended from heaven again. It never yielded rulers with impossible lifespans once more. After the flood, kings governed through bloodlines, through conquest in battle, through political strategies, but never again via direct divine designation. The gods didn't perish in the flood. The temples stayed. Ceremonies persisted. Prayers were presented, but the gods ceased ruling. This change shows up in Egyptian documents, biblical lineages, and kingship customs throughout the ancient world. An initial era of straightforward divine participation, followed by an abrupt move to human independence. If the Sumerian king list is documenting real history, even figuratively, then it's not portraying the emergence of civilization. It's portraying the instant when humanity was left to manage itself. What the king list compels us to face isn't if ancient gods existed in some concrete way. It's whether ancient documents reliably describe a retreat event, a point when entities who had governed, taught, and organized early communities halted their direct participation, a boundary after which humanity needed to sustain civilization instead of obtaining it. The flood isn't a tale of penalty or purification. It's a tale of conclusion. And if the oldest historical text in human hands designates that conclusion as the start of identifiable human history, then we must pose a query that renders most historians profoundly uneasy. What precisely was the world like before the gods departed? And why do the documents maintain that they were ever present at all? The British Museum possesses a fragment that most guests pass without noticing twice. It's catalogue number K11261+, a shattered clay tablet inscribed with cuneiform script, part of what experts call the dynastic chronicle, dating to about 500 BC. It's one of various copies scribes produced from much older king lists, comparing diverse versions, observing inconsistencies, attempting to harmonize conflicting reign durations. Even the ancient Babylonians considered these early documents perplexing. What bothered them wasn't the presence of pre-flood kings, that they embraced as factual history. What bothered them was the discrepancy in the figures. Some versions enumerated 8 antediluvian rulers. Others listed 10. Reign durations varied greatly between copies, but every version concurred on one aspect. There was a distinct separation, a before and an after, and the flood designated the boundary between them. Contemporary scholarship regards this separation as legendary, a handy storytelling tool ancient societies employed to divide mythical times from historical ones. But that rationale presumes ancient scribes couldn't differentiate between folklore and documentation. The proof indicates otherwise. When you study the Sumerian king list, beside its later Babylonian duplicates, a pattern surfaces that's tough to attribute to mere mythology. The pre-flood segment stays consistent despite being duplicated across millennia. The names stay uniform. Alulim is always initial. Eridu is always the first city. The framework endures. The post-flood segment, conversely, displays the anticipated differences you'd encounter in any historical text passed down over centuries. Various dynasties highlighted regional distinctions, political revisions. This is the opposite of what you'd anticipate if the pre-flood part were fabricated. Myths transform, they alter, details shift with every retelling. Historical documents, when duplicated meticulously, stay consistent. The pre-flood king list acts like something being safeguarded, not invented. The Sumerian term used to depict what occurred after the flood is Nam-Lugal, kingship, not governance or rulership in a vague sense. The precise institution of sacred kingship. Nam-Lugal emerges throughout Mesopotamian texts with a steady meaning. Legitimate power stemming from divine approval. It's what distinguished a king from a warlord, a dynasty from a military takeover. The king list declares that after the flood, Nam-Lugal was brought down again to the city of Kish, not founded, not created, brought down again. The wording suggests revival of something that had existed previously, but the text never asserts the pre-flood kings ruled by the same means. They're merely enumerated. No divine approval cited. No legitimacy debated. It's as if their power was obvious in a manner that later rulers' power was not. After the flood, kings required validation. They needed to assert divine designation, construct monuments, order inscriptions proclaiming their legitimacy. The early kings evidently didn't. The alteration in reign durations is striking enough to spot right away, but there's a more subtle shift that surfaces across numerous ancient Near Eastern sources. Pre-flood rulers are portrayed with what linguists term passive authority. They don't conquer, they don't construct, they don't wage wars. They simply exist as kings. The land falls under their control without account of how that control was gained or sustained. Post-flood rulers, even mythical ones like Gilgamesh, are characterized by their deeds. They erect walls. They battle foes. They seek immortality. They perform actions to validate their power. This change appears not only in Sumerian texts, but in Egyptian documents, where the god dynasties that govern before the first dynasty are enumerated without achievements, while human pharaohs promptly begin constructing monuments and documenting military triumphs. It's as if early rulership was a condition of existence, while later rulership turned into a display. Archaeological examinations of the earliest Mesopotamian communities uncover something unforeseen. Cities like Eridu, the initial city in the king list, exhibit signs of advanced urban design from their earliest strata. No steady expansion from village to town to city. Eridu emerges in the archaeological record already structured around a central temple area with distinct zoning for living, administrative, and sacred zones. The same configuration appears at Uruk, at Ur, at Bad Tibira. Early settlement strata display sophisticated planning principles already established. Typical archaeological explanation attributes this to urbanism originating elsewhere first and extending to Mesopotamia, but there's no evidence elsewhere in the archaeological record. No clear prototype cities. Mesopotamian urban design emerges, operates effectively for centuries, and then, like the king list itself, appears to change after a boundary we can't precisely date, but that aligns roughly with the era ancient sources label the flood. After this boundary, cities expand naturally. They grow irregularly. They exhibit the anticipated patterns of human development through trial and error. Before it, they seem finished. Modern accounts of civilization commence with Sumerian city-states around 3500 BC. They outline the gradual creation of writing, the gradual advancement of bronze metallurgy, the rise of social hierarchy. But the Sumerians themselves didn't portray their civilization this way. They portrayed it as something upheld after a disastrous break, something advanced by survivors who recalled a prior order. The king list doesn't state Eridu was established or Alulim founded kingship. It states kingship descended to Eridu. It was already present, already operating, already whole. And then after 241,200 years and 8 rulers, it ceased operating in whatever manner it had before. The flood swept over, and afterward, humanity had to determine how to run a civilization they inherited, but didn't create. If the oldest historical record indicates a shift instead of a beginning, what precisely altered? More crucially, who was no longer present to sustain it? In the Louvre Museum, tablet A08864 safeguards something uncommon. A Babylonian chronicle from around 1700 BC that enumerates the rulers of Isin, a city that gained importance after Ur's fall. The text adheres to standard king list format, names, reign durations, key events, but the initial line differs from later entries. It reads, "After the divine Ishbi era, not King Ishbi era, not Ishbi era, beloved of Enlil, used is Dingir, the cuneiform sign that particularly denotes divinity, the same emblem used for gods. Yet Ishbi era ruled around 2000 BC, well into the historical era. His dynasty endured barely a century before falling. His achievements are recorded in ordinary administrative texts about grain allocation and border conflicts. He was, by all proof, completely human. So why does the chronicle designate him divine? The solution emerges in what follows. Later kings are never termed divine. They're mighty king, beloved of the gods, appointed by Enlil, but never themselves gods. Something shifted between the first ruler and his heirs, not in actuality, but in how rulership itself was viewed. The early post-flood period displays rulers urgently claiming divinity they no longer held. Naturally, Sumerian includes 2 distinct grammatical structures for depicting divine rulership, and the distinction is telling. When texts portray pre-flood or immediate post-flood rulers, they employ Nam Dingir Ra, divine nature. It's a condition of being, like Nam Lugal kingship or Nam Ti life. Not a title awarded, but an innate trait. When later texts portray kings asserting divine status, they use Dingir Gu, my god, or as a god, with a possessive or comparative suffix. It's aspirational, metaphorical, something being asserted, not something that simply exists. This linguistic change surfaces across Mesopotamian texts around the same chronological boundary. The third dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BC, signifies the last significant effort to resurrect the idea of divine kingship in Sumerian society. Kings like Ur-Nammu and Shulgi constructed enormous temple complexes, ordered hymns portraying their divinity, and reorganized the whole administrative system around their godlike position. It persisted for 3 generations. Afterward, no Mesopotamian dynasty earnestly claimed divine rulership again. Kings stayed beloved of gods, chosen by gods, granted power by gods, always through mediation, never direct. The era of god-kings concluded not with a spectacular overthrow, but with a subtle acknowledgement that such rulership was no longer feasible. The Sumerian king list identifies 5 antediluvian cities: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Archaeological proof verifies these are among the oldest communities in Mesopotamia. But here's what's odd. Post-flood, when new cities arise and gain prominence, Kish, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, the texts always attribute their founding to human kings or divine protectors acting through human representatives. We're informed who constructed the first temples, who planned the city walls, who set up the institutions. The 5 antediluvian cities lack such founding stories. They simply exist, already operating when the king list starts, already complete with their temple complexes and administrative frameworks. Eridu's temple to Enki, called the Iabzu, appears in texts as if it had always been there. No building tale, no dedication ritual. The god is simply present in his temple, in his city, from the outset. Later temples possess detailed foundation myths. Kings describe placing the first brick, conducting sacred rites, obtaining divine consent for the building. The earliest temples are handled as geographical facts, like mountains or rivers. A thorough examination of early Mesopotamian royal inscriptions uncovers titles that surface briefly after the flood and then vanish entirely from the historical record. The most notable is Ninmiar, roughly meaning Lord of all the divine powers. It emerges in fragmentary texts describing the immediate post-flood rulers of Kish. But by the time of the third dynasty of Ur, it's absent. Later kings assert impressive titles: King of the Four Quarters, Shepherd of the Black-Headed People, Mighty Man of Enlil. But never again do they assert dominion over me, the divine powers or cosmic ordinances themselves. The notion of me is essential to Mesopotamian philosophy. These were the basic principles that controlled reality: kingship, priesthood, truth, falsehood, craftsmanship, agriculture. They weren't rules humans devised, but forces they uncovered and learned to control. Early post-flood rulers claimed mastery over the me themselves. Later rulers merely claimed to wield kingship, which was itself one of the me. The distinction is deep. One group placed themselves as overseers of cosmic principles. The next group placed themselves as subjects functioning within those principles. Authority of a wholly different type had retreated. Here's what renders this pattern hard to reject as mere political progression. The religious framework never fell apart. Temples kept functioning. Priest classes held their roles. Rituals were carried out with growing complexity and accuracy. The gods stayed central to Mesopotamian culture for thousands of years after the flood boundary. But the gods stopped governing. Early texts portray gods issuing direct decisions about where cities should be constructed, which kings should govern, when wars should be waged. These aren't prayers seeking guidance. They're managerial exchanges. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest Sumerian creation texts, portrays Ninlil, the goddess who births humanity, walking among cities, issuing decisions, reorganizing communities. The language is direct and tangible. After the flood boundary, divine exchange becomes mediated. Gods communicate through omens, through dreams, through priests analyzing liver patterns or the flight of birds. The change is from conversation to divination. Gods who once provided instructions now demand interpretation. What renders this withdrawal pattern so historically troublesome is that religious tradition maintains nothing altered. Priests in 500 BC executed rituals they asserted traced back to antediluvian times. Temple liturgies safeguard phrases in archaic Sumerian that later priests didn't completely comprehend but meticulously upheld anyway. The forms persisted. The institutions endured. The sacred calendar still organized the year, but the presence outlined in the earliest texts, the direct, unmediated, physically evident divine authority, had turned into memory safeguarded in ritual. Kings still asserted divine designation, but they needed extensive theological rationale for that assertion: detailed coronation rites, priestly confirmation, omen interpretations, and public ceremonies. None of this surfaces in descriptions of antediluvian rulership. Early kingship needed no rationale because there was no one to rationalize it to. Authority descended from heaven and simply existed. Later, kingship needed constant rationale because it now operated in the absence of its original origin. If the gods didn't perish and they didn't rule anymore, where did they depart to? And why did every culture that inherited their vacant temples devote thousands of years attempting to summon them back? The Turin royal canon, stored in the Museo Egizio in Turin, is one of the most fragmented and vital documents from ancient Egypt, dating to the reign of Rameses II around 1250 BC. It's a papyrus scroll that originally enumerated every pharaoh from the divine dynasties through the human rulers of the New Kingdom. Much of it is ruined beyond salvage. But one segment survives nearly whole: the transition point. The papyrus enumerates the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, 9 semi-divine dynasties that governed Egypt before the first dynasty. Their combined rule is noted as 13,420 years. Then comes a damaged area where the papyrus fractures. When it continues, we're reading about Menes, the first historically accepted pharaoh, whose rule is listed as 62 years, from 13,420 years of divine governance to 62 years of human kingship. The papyrus doesn't clarify the change. It simply documents both as successive historical periods. What renders this especially notable is that Egyptian priests of the Greco-Roman period, writing thousands of years after these events, uphold the exact same chronological structure. Manetho, writing around 280 BC, safeguards the same divine dynasties, the same impossible durations, and the same sudden transition. They weren't fabricating mythology. They were safeguarding a chronology they considered factual. The Book of Genesis offers a lifespan curve that shouldn't appear in religious writings. It's too particular, too methodical, too mathematically exact to fulfill a theological role. Before the flood, Adam survives 930 years. Seth survives 912 years. Methuselah, the longest lived, attains 969 years. The flood happens. Right after, Shem survives 600 years. His son Arpachshad survives 438 years. The next generation falls to 433 years. By Abraham's era, 10 generations post-flood, lifespans have dropped to 175 years. By Moses' time, 120 years is shown as remarkable. By David's period, Psalm 90 portrays a typical human lifespan as 70 years or 80, if our strength persists. Essentially, modern human longevity. This isn't lyrical or emblematic. The numbers decline with mathematical consistency, generation by generation, adhering to a curve of biological reduction. If Genesis were purely legendary, why incorporate this pattern? Why not maintain lifespans consistently remarkable throughout, or consistently ordinary? Why display a methodical collapse over precisely 10 generations? The pattern implies the preservation of a chronological custom that predates the biblical text itself. What compels us to regard these chronologies earnestly isn't that one culture documented extreme lifespans. It's that multiple geographically isolated cultures document the same pattern. Sumerian king list, 8 rulers, 241,200 years total, then the flood, then reigns measured in centuries falling swiftly to decades. Egyptian records, divine dynasties enduring millennia, then the flood remembered as the first time ending, then human pharaohs with normal lifespans. Biblical genealogy, patriarchs surviving nearly a millennium, then the flood, then a generational drop to modern human longevity. These texts weren't composed in consultation with one another. The Sumerian king list predates Genesis by over 1,000 years. Egyptian dynastic records evolved independently in a totally different linguistic and cultural setting. Yet all three safeguard the same narrative framework: extreme longevity before a disastrous boundary, followed by quick biological normalization. Coincidence demands believing three distinct cultures independently devised the exact same false pattern and upheld it through millennia of textual passing. The alternative is that all three are safeguarding fragmented recollections of the same chronological reality. Ancient chronologists observed something modern scholars often dismiss. The numbers aren't arbitrary. The antediluvian reigns in the Sumerian king list are all multiples of 3,600, their highest time unit. This has prompted scholars to propose the numbers are purely emblematic, cosmic cycles depicted as individual reigns. But that hypothesis collapses when you study the post-flood section. The post-flood reigns don't follow tidy mathematical patterns. They're uneven, inconsistent, historically believable. Some kings govern 90 years, others 30, others 7. It's precisely the kind of variation you'd anticipate from actual historical data. If the pre-flood numbers are emblematic, why does the symbolism halt abruptly after the flood? Why transition from cosmic mathematics to chaotic historical reality at precisely the same boundary marked by other cultures? The same issue surfaces in Genesis. Pre-flood patriarchs display numerical patterns. Many of their ages are multiples of significant numbers in Hebrew numerology. Post-flood descendants display no such patterns. Their lifespans are irregular, declining at varying rates. Historically messy. The shift from mathematical order to mathematical chaos occurs at the same boundary in both traditions. The Turin Canon's damaged section, the break between divine and human dynasties, aligns with a period Egyptian tradition calls Zep Tepi, the first time. Later Egyptian texts don't portray Zep Tepi as a creation event. They portray it as an ending. The time when the gods physically governed Egypt from Memphis and Heliopolis concluded, and the time of humans commenced. The Palermo stone, one of Egypt's oldest royal annals, dating to the 5th dynasty, around 2400 BC, holds a fragmentary section enumerating pre-dynastic rulers. The entries are partially ruined, but the surviving names employ the divine determinative, the hieroglyphic symbol signifying gods, not humans. These weren't legendary additions made by later scribes. They're part of Egypt's earliest attempt at systematic historical documentation. Egyptian chronology, like Mesopotamian and biblical chronology, treats the pre-catastrophe period not as mythology, but as a different historical era governed by different rules. If these lifespans were metaphorical or emblematic, why show decline? Metaphors don't need to deteriorate. Symbols can stay constant. If early cultures wanted to convey divine authority or legendary status, they could have simply upheld extraordinary lifespans throughout their records. Instead, all three traditions display the same methodical collapse. Sumerian post-flood kings don't instantly become mortal. The transition requires centuries, with each generation reigning slightly less time than the prior one until they attain historically normal lengths. Biblical patriarchs don't abruptly live 80 years after the flood. They decline slowly, generation by generation, as if some biological capacity were being lost step by step. Egyptian pharaohs don't immediately become fully human after the divine dynasties. Early dynastic kings still assert partial divinity, semi-divine status, connection to the gods, claims that weaken with each successive dynasty until they become purely ceremonial. This is the pattern of something being lost, not invented, the pattern of an inheritance depleting. What kind of world permits beings to survive for millennia? And why does that world suddenly vanish? More troubling, why would three separate civilizations preserve a memory of that vanishing with such uncomfortable precision? In 1929, archaeologists excavating the ancient city of Uruk uncovered a small limestone tablet no larger than a modern smartphone. Catalog number W940826. It's one of the oldest examples of writing ever discovered, dating to approximately 3400 BC. What shocked researchers wasn't that they'd found early writing. It was that the writing was already sophisticated. The tablet contains a complex administrative record, calculations involving grain storage, worker rations, and temple distributions. It uses a fully developed numerical notation system, standardized signs for different types of goods, and demonstrates clear understanding of multiplicative relationships. This isn't primitive markings or simple pictographs. It's accounting, bureaucratic mathematics deployed at scale, and it appears in the archaeological record with no preceding developmental stages. The standard model of civilization assumes a gradual evolution. Simple marks become pictographs. Pictographs become ideograms. Ideograms eventually develop into full writing systems over centuries of refinement. That progression doesn't exist in Mesopotamia. Writing appears suddenly, already functional, already serving complex administrative purposes. Within 2 generations, barely 60 years, it evolves from this sophisticated accounting notation into full cuneiform, capable of recording abstract ideas, legal codes, and literature. The speed isn't just unusual. According to linguistic models of script development, it's impossible. The Uruk tablet uses base 60 mathematics. The sexagesimal system. We still use it today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. But consider what base 60 implies. It's not a simple counting system an early society would naturally develop. Base 10 makes sense. Humans have 10 fingers. Base 20 appears in some cultures because we have 20 total digits including toes. Base 5 emerges from counting on one hand. Base 60 requires abstract mathematical thinking. It demands understanding of factorization. 60 is divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes it extraordinarily useful for complex calculations, astronomy, and geometry. It's the kind of numerical system you design if you already understood advanced mathematics and wanted maximum computational flexibility. The Sumerians didn't gradually discover that 60 was a useful base. They started with it. Their earliest mathematical tablets assume base 60 as foundational. No simpler systems precede it in the archaeological record. Even more curious, when other aspects of Sumerian civilization declined or changed, base 60 mathematics persisted. It spread to Babylon, to Egypt, to Greece, eventually to the entire world. The International System of Units still uses it for measuring time and angles. A Bronze Age civilization in southern Iraq developed a mathematical system so efficient that 5,000 years of subsequent civilizations couldn't improve on it. In 1954, excavations at Eridu reached the lowest occupation layers of the city. Archaeologists expected to find simple structures, huts, perhaps early mud brick buildings showing experimental construction techniques. Instead, they found Temple 17, a precisely planned religious complex with a central sanctuary, offering platforms, altar placements, and clear architectural sophistication. The walls were straight. The corners were true right angles. The foundation showed evidence of deliberate site preparation and leveling. This wasn't the first temple. Underneath it were 16 earlier temples, each built directly on top of the previous one, each showing the same architectural competence. The sequence goes down to Temple 1, the earliest structure, radiocarbon dated to around 5,400 BC, and Temple 1 isn't primitive. It's simply smaller than the later versions, but equally well constructed. The temple complex at Eridu shows no learning curve. The earliest iteration demonstrates the same construction principles as temples built 2,000 years later. The same pattern appears at other early sites. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 9,500 BC, consists of massive stone pillars arranged in circles, carved with sophisticated animal reliefs. No simpler proto-versions exist. No practice pillars. The site appears fully realized. Standard archaeological interpretation suggests skilled workers from unknown earlier cultures built these structures, implying civilization existed somewhere else first. But there is no somewhere else in the record. These are the oldest complex structures discovered. They represent the beginning of monumental architecture, and they're already masterworks. The Code of Ur-Nammu, dating to approximately 2100 BC, is the oldest surviving law code. It's written in clear, organized Sumerian, establishing legal principles, court procedures, and standardized punishments. What's remarkable isn't that early societies had laws. It's the sophistication of the legal reasoning. The code distinguishes between intentional and accidental harm, a concept requiring abstract understanding of mental state. It establishes proportional punishment based on injury severity. It creates different legal categories for free citizens versus slaves, showing complex social stratification already formalized in law. This level of legal philosophy usually develops over centuries. Roman law, often considered the foundation of Western legal tradition, evolved across 800 years of republican and imperial refinement. The Code of Ur-Nammu appears to be based on even earlier legal traditions. It references former judgments and ancient decisions, suggesting Sumerian law was already old by 2100 BC. Yet we have no archaeological evidence of the centuries of legal evolution this implies. The same problem appears in mathematics. The earliest Sumerian mathematical tablets solve quadratic equations. They calculate square roots and cube roots. They use the Pythagorean theorem 1,000 years before Pythagoras. These aren't elementary mathematics slowly developed by trial and error. They're advanced techniques that normally require generations of mathematical innovation to discover. Babylonian astronomical texts from around 700 BC contain mathematical models predicting planetary movements with startling accuracy. The mathematics involved, numerical integration, iterative approximation methods, wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe until the 17th century. But here's what's strange. These Babylonian tablets explicitly describe their astronomical knowledge as inherited from old texts and ancient observations. The tablets reference astronomical data spanning centuries, eclipse cycles, planetary positions, stellar movements, far longer than the lifetime of any individual astronomer or even any individual dynasty. This suggests systematic astronomical observation maintained across generations, but maintained where? The earliest Babylonian astronomical texts appear around 1800 BC, already referencing long-term observation programs. Where are the preceding centuries of recorded observations they claim to be analyzing? The Babylonian priests insisted they were interpreting records from before the flood. Modern scholars dismiss this as mythological framing. But if the astronomical knowledge isn't from pre-flood records, where did it come from? The mathematical sophistication alone represents centuries of development, yet it appears in texts claiming to be copying from older sources we've never found. Here's what makes this pattern truly anomalous. After the initial burst of sophistication, development slows. Writing appears fully functional around 3400 BC. By 3000 BC, it's recording complex literature. Then it stabilizes. Cuneiform doesn't fundamentally change for the next 2000 years. Improvements are incremental. New signs added, phonetic elements refined, but the basic system remains static. Mathematics appears complete with base 60, geometric understanding, and algebraic techniques. Then it plateaus. Later cultures use Sumerian mathematics, but don't substantially advance it for millennia. Monumental architecture appears sophisticated at Göbekli Tepe and Eridu. Later temples are larger, more decorated, but not more structurally advanced. The engineering principles stay the same. If civilization were invented from scratch around 3500 BC, we'd expect accelerating innovation, each generation building rapidly on previous discoveries. Instead, we see early completion followed by slow refinement. The pattern doesn't match invention. It matches inheritance and gradual loss of understanding. If humans didn't slowly invent civilization, if writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and law appeared already sophisticated, who left behind the instruction manual? And why does the trail of evidence go cold exactly where ancient records say it should? At the flood boundary, where something ended and humanity had to maintain what remained. The Yale Babylonian collection holds tablet YBC 4644, a clay cylinder from approximately 1800 BC containing what's known as a liver omen text. It's a divination manual instructing priests how to interpret the shape, color, and markings on a sacrificed sheep's liver to determine the will of the gods. The tablet is remarkably detailed. It describes 63 different liver configurations and what each supposedly means. A split in the gallbladder indicates military defeat. A darkened left lobe suggests the king's illness. Specific vein patterns predict harvest failures. What makes this text historically significant isn't its content, it's what it represents. By 1800 BC, Mesopotamian priests needed elaborate interpretive systems to understand divine will. The gods no longer gave instructions directly. They communicated through signs that required specialist knowledge to decode. But the texts these same priests preserved describe an earlier time when such interpretation wasn't necessary. The gods simply spoke, gave orders, made decisions openly. Something fundamental had changed in how divine authority functioned. And the change happened exactly where you'd expect if the ancient chronologies are accurate, at the boundary. The earliest Sumerian religious texts use a specific grammatical construction that later texts avoid. The imperative voice attributed directly to gods without mediation. In the Eridu Genesis, when the god Enki decides to save humanity from the flood, the text reads, Enki opened his mouth and addressed Ziusudra, tear down your house, build a boat. Direct speech, clear instruction, no interpretation required. Compare this to texts from 1,000 years later. The Epic of Era, composed around 800 BC, describes the god Era's anger at Babylon. But Era doesn't speak directly to humans. He communicates through dreams given to priests who then interpret the dream's symbolic content to determine what the god wants. The shift is consistent across the textual record. Early religious texts present gods as participants in conversations. Later texts present gods as sources of signs requiring interpretation. By the first millennium BC, Mesopotamian religion had developed entire professional classes. Baru priests, who specialized in extispicy, Ashipu priests, who interpreted omens, Mahu priests, who studied ecstatic visions, all dedicated to decoding divine messages that had apparently stopped being clear. If the gods were always silent, why develop increasingly complex interpretive systems? Why not start with divination? The evolution suggests something was being replaced, a clear signal that had degraded into noise, requiring sophisticated filtering to understand. Early temples in Mesopotamia are structurally different from later ones in a way that rarely gets emphasized. Temples at Eridu, dating to the 6th millennium BC, contain central chambers with raised platforms, presumed god seats, but relatively little space for human worshippers. The architecture implies the temple was the god's residence, not primarily a gathering place for human religious ceremony. By the 3rd millennium BC, temple design changes. Spaces for priestly activities expand. Storage rooms for ritual implements multiply. Areas for public ceremonies become prominent. The temple evolves from divine residence to interpretive center. The ziggurat, the iconic stepped pyramid temple of later Mesopotamia, appears around 2100 BC, with Ur-Nammu's reconstruction of temple complexes. These massive structures have something earlier temples lack: elaborate processional pathways, spaces for ritual performance, platforms for public displays of religious ceremony. The ziggurat isn't designed for a god who walks into the temple and gives instructions. It's designed for priests who perform increasingly elaborate rituals, attempting to invoke divine presence that no longer manifests automatically. The architecture reflects the theological shift: direct presence replaced by ceremonial invocation. In early Sumerian city-states, the En, the high priest or priestess, wasn't an interpreter of divine will. Texts describe the En as someone who dwells with the god, suggesting a role as companion or attendant rather than intermediary. By the Akkadian period around 2300 BC, the priesthood has fragmented into specialized roles. We see distinct classes: those who perform sacrifices, those who maintain temples, those who interpret omens, those who record divine communications received in dreams. This proliferation of religious specialists makes sense only if divine communication has become problematic. If God spoke clearly, you'd need speakers and listeners, not an entire bureaucracy of interpretation. The Code of Hammurabi, dated to 1750 BC, provides explicit payment schedules for different types of divinatory consultations. Extispicy, reading animal organs, commands the highest fees, suggesting it was considered the most reliable method of determining divine will. But reliability implies uncertainty. If the gods spoke directly, there would be no fees for interpretation because there would be nothing to interpret. By the Neo-Assyrian period around 700 BC, the Mesopotamian royal court employed full-time diviners who filed written reports on every omen observed: bird flights, oil patterns on water, lunar eclipses, unusual births. Archives at Nineveh contain thousands of such reports. The sheer volume of interpretive effort suggests a civilization desperately trying to maintain contact with divine authority that had become inaccessible through normal channels. Ritual complexity increases over time in a pattern that mirrors the shift from presence to interpretation. Early Sumerian religious texts describe simple offerings. A god requires grain or beer or specific animals. The offering is made. The text records that the god accepted it or rejected it, implying some clear indication of divine response. By the Babylonian period, rituals have become extraordinarily complex. The Bit Rimki, the ritual washing ceremony, involves precise timing, specific phrases in archaic Sumerian that contemporary priests didn't fully understand, exact positioning of ritual implements, and careful observation for signs of acceptance. The rituals aren't becoming more complex because gods demand it. They're becoming more complex because humans are uncertain whether they're being heard. Later Mesopotamian religious texts include phrases like, "If the god accepts this offering, and should the goddess be pleased." Early texts don't contain these conditional statements. They record what the god said or did, not what humans hoped the god might do. The addition of uncertainty into religious language tracks with the shift from dialogue to divination. What makes this transformation historically peculiar is that later religions don't acknowledge it as a transformation. Babylonian priests in 500 BC performed rituals they claimed were identical to those performed 3,000 years earlier. They maintained temple liturgies in archaic Sumerian, a language no longer spoken. They preserved architectural forms and ceremonial practices that had, according to their own records, been established when the gods dwelt among us. The phrase itself is revealing. When the gods dwelt among us, past tense. But those same priests never explicitly state that the gods had left. They maintain the fiction that proper ritual can still invoke divine presence, that correct interpretation can still discern divine will. The entire structure of later Mesopotamian religion is built around maintaining contact with something that is no longer present, while never admitting the absence directly. This produces the central paradox of all post-flood religion. Elaborate systems designed to communicate with beings who have stopped communicating, performed by specialists who preserve memories of a time when no specialists were needed. Why do all later religions try to interpret silence instead of hearing voices? And if the gods didn't die, if temples remained sacred, if rituals continued, if their names were still invoked, what exactly happened that turned conversation into divination and presence into absence? In the Mesopotamian galleries of the British Museum, tablet K3375 preserves part of the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The section describes Utnapishtim's account of the Great Flood. But there's a detail most visitors overlook. After the waters recede and Utnapishtim makes his sacrifice, the gods gather around the offering like flies, starving and desperate. The god Enlil is furious when he discovers humanity survived. Another god, Ea, has to argue for humanity's preservation. This isn't the behavior of omnipotent beings orchestrating events according to divine plan. These are gods who've lost control of their own catastrophe. The text continues with something even stranger. After the argument, Enlil approaches Utnapishtim and his wife, touches their foreheads and declares, "Formerly Utnapishtim was a human being, but now he and his wife shall be like us gods." Then he sends them away, far away, to the mouth of the rivers, a distant place where humans cannot reach. The flood narrative doesn't end with the gods resuming rulership over a cleansed world. It ends with the last human granted divine status being exiled to a location deliberately removed from human contact. The gods don't return to govern. They retreat, and humanity is left to rebuild without them. Compare flood narratives across cultures, and a consistent pattern emerges that contradicts standard mythological interpretation. In the Sumerian version, Ziusudra is warned by Enki and builds a boat. After the flood, he's granted immortality and immediately removed from the world. In the biblical account, Noah is warned by God, builds an ark, survives. After the flood, God makes a covenant, but never again speaks directly to humanity with the same clarity. Later, biblical figures must interpret signs, build altars, hope for divine contact. In the Greek tradition, Deucalion is warned by Prometheus, survives the deluge. The gods he knew, the Titans who ruled before, are gone, replaced by the Olympians who rule from a distance. In Hindu tradition, Manu is warned by Matsya, survives the flood. The Satya Yuga, the golden age of direct divine rulership, ends. The following ages show progressive degradation of divine presence. The pattern isn't punishment followed by restoration. It's warning followed by departure. Survivors are preserved not to serve the gods who saved them, but to continue without them. Between 12,900 and 11,700 years ago, Earth experienced the Younger Dryas, a dramatic climate reversal that interrupted the warming trend following the last ice age. Ice cores from Greenland show temperature drops of up to 15 degrees Celsius occurring within a decade. Sea levels fluctuated wildly. Massive glacial lake outbursts released catastrophic floods. Megafauna extinctions accelerated globally. For over 1,000 years, Earth's climate system destabilized in ways that would have made agriculture impossible, coastal settlements uninhabitable, and large-scale civilization unsustainable. Then, around 11,700 years ago, the climate suddenly stabilized again. Within a single human lifetime, temperatures normalized. Rainfall patterns became predictable. Sea levels steadied. Conventional archaeology places the origins of civilization after this boundary. Göbekli Tepe, the earliest known monumental architecture, dates to 9,500 BC, well after the Younger Dryas ended. The question archaeology struggles with: why did civilization appear so suddenly after the climate stabilized? If humans had the cognitive capacity and social organization to build Göbekli Tepe in 9,500 BC, why didn't they build anything comparable during the preceding 100,000 years of anatomically modern human existence? One explanation: they did. But anything built before the Younger Dryas would have been destroyed by the very climate catastrophe ancient texts remember as the flood. What's consistently strange about flood narratives is that survivors possess knowledge inappropriate for their circumstances. Utnapishtim knows how to build a seaworthy vessel using precise mathematical ratios. He's given detailed construction specifications. Yet he's described as living in a time before the flood, before recognizable civilization begins. Noah receives architectural instructions for the ark that demonstrate understanding of displacement, buoyancy, and structural engineering. Manu is warned by a fish that grows to enormous size, speaks with knowledge of future events, and provides survival instructions. These aren't stories of primitive humans accidentally surviving natural disasters. They're stories of individuals specifically chosen and instructed, given knowledge they shouldn't possess, warned by beings who understand what's coming. The preservation isn't random, it's selective, and those selected carry something forward: knowledge, instructions, or simply memory of what existed before. After the biblical flood, God establishes a covenant with Noah. Never again will flood waters destroy all life. The promise is often interpreted as reassurance, but read carefully, it's a statement of withdrawal. God isn't promising continued presence or protection. He's promising non-intervention. The rainbow isn't a symbol of divine guardianship. It's a reminder that the direct catastrophic involvement demonstrated in the flood will not recur. The covenant marks a boundary between an age of direct divine action and an age of human autonomy. Similar declarations appear in other traditions. After the Greek flood, Zeus promises no more cataclysmic interventions. After the Hindu deluge, the gods retreat into more distant heavens, allowing the ages of man to unfold with decreasing divine involvement. The flood narratives aren't about God saving humanity. They're about God stepping back and allowing humanity to continue alone. Modern interpretations of flood myths focus on moral cleansing. Humanity was wicked. Gods destroyed the world. Survivors represented a fresh start for a purified species. But the ancient texts themselves don't emphasize human wickedness. The Sumerian account gives no moral reason for the flood. The gods simply decide to send it. Enki's decision to save Ziusudra is portrayed as rebellion against the other gods' decree, not as reward for righteousness. The Babylonian version in the Epic of Gilgamesh attributes the flood to Enlil's irritation at human noise disturbing his sleep. Hardly a moral judgment. Even Genesis, which does cite human wickedness, describes a world where the sons of God were interbreeding with humans, producing Nephilim. The wickedness isn't clearly defined, and the flood's primary effect isn't purification, it's separation. After the flood, the sons of God are gone. The Nephilim are gone. The beings who walked among humans and produced hybrid offspring are absent from post-flood narratives. The flood doesn't cleanse humanity. It removes what was among humanity. At archaeological sites across the Near East, there's a layer. Excavations at Ur uncovered an 8-foot deposit of water-laid clay with no artifacts, separating earlier occupation layers from later ones. Leonard Woolley, the excavator, initially declared he'd found evidence of Noah's flood. Similar sterile flood deposits appear at Kish, at Shurupak, at Uruk. Not all sites show the layer. Not all layers date to the same period, but the deposits exist, evidence of significant flooding events in Mesopotamia's early history. The layers aren't global. They don't prove a worldwide deluge, but they demonstrate that catastrophic flooding was a lived reality for early Mesopotamian populations. What makes these deposits archaeologically significant isn't whether they prove the flood myth. It's what appears after them. The sudden explosion of sophisticated urban culture in Sumer around 3500 BC. Before the flood layers, scattered settlements, simple structures. After the flood layers, cities, writing, complex administration, all appearing within a few centuries, as if civilization wasn't invented after the floods, but rebuilt. If the flood closed the age of gods, who carried memory of that world into the new one? And what did they remember that made every subsequent culture structure its entire chronology around the same catastrophic boundary? In 1853, Hormuzd Rassam, working under Austin Henry Layard, discovered 12 clay tablets in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh. When translated, they contained the most complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh ever found, a narrative that scholars immediately recognized as one of humanity's oldest surviving stories. But buried in the 11th tablet was something that transformed how we understand the epic's purpose. Gilgamesh doesn't quest for immortality because he fears death as a concept. He quests for it because he knows it once existed. He's searching for something his ancestors possessed, and he believes he's entitled to reclaim. The epic isn't about a king's fear of mortality. It's about humanity's first confrontation with the fact that the old world, the world before the flood, is permanently closed. And the being who delivers this message is the last person who remembers that world firsthand. The Sumerian king list records Gilgamesh as the 5th king of Uruk's first dynasty, reigning for 126 years around 2700 BC. Archaeological evidence confirms a historical king named Gilgamesh. Early texts reference him. Later kings claim descent from him, and his construction projects can be verified. But what makes Gilgamesh unique in the king list is his parentage. The text identifies his father as Lugalbanda, a mortal king who ruled before him. But his mother is listed as Ninsun, described explicitly as a goddess. The text uses the divine determinative, leaving no ambiguity. Gilgamesh is Ushumgal, a Sumerian term meaning great dragon or prime serpent, but used in royal context to indicate semi-divine status. He's 2/3 god, 1/3 human, a biological impossibility that the epic treats as historical fact. This makes him a bridge figure, the last king with direct divine lineage, born late enough to be historically verifiable, but early enough to remember or have been told about a time when such lineage was normal. His reign falls exactly in the transitional period after the flood, after the impossible lifespans ended, but still close enough to that boundary that memory of the prior age would have been vivid. The epic begins not with Gilgamesh fearing death, but with him experiencing it. His companion Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh is devastated not just emotionally, but existentially. He says something revealing. "Shall I die too? Am I not like Enkidu?" The question isn't rhetorical fear. It's genuine confusion. Gilgamesh has divine blood. His mother is a goddess. His ancestors in the king list, rulers just a few generations before him, lived for centuries. The pre-flood kings lived for millennia. Death for beings like him shouldn't be inevitable. Yet Enkidu dies completely, permanently, reduced to dust like any mortal human. And Gilgamesh realizes that whatever biological advantage his divine heritage once provided, it's failing. The immortality that should be his birthright is slipping away. His quest isn't about avoiding death. It's about reclaiming what his lineage should have guaranteed. Gilgamesh's journey to find Utnapishtim isn't geographically random. Every location he passes through is described as progressively more removed from the normal world. He crosses mountain ranges guarded by scorpion beings, creatures explicitly described as half-human, half-divine, relics of an earlier creation. They're shocked that a mortal would attempt the passage, but they recognize his partial divinity and let him through. He travels through 12 leagues of darkness, a journey no human has made before. The path exists, but it's not meant for post-flood humanity. He crosses the waters of death, which his boatman warns will kill him if he touches them. The precautions required, cutting 120 punting poles because each can only be used once, suggest this isn't a metaphorical journey, but a description of navigating some genuinely dangerous boundary. The geography of the quest maps onto a psychological reality. Gilgamesh is traveling backward in time, crossing boundaries that separate the post-flood world from remnants of what existed before. And at the end of this journey, he finds the only human being who survived the transition intact. When Gilgamesh finally reaches Utnapishtim, the survivor's first words are unexpected. He doesn't congratulate Gilgamesh on completing an impossible journey. He asks, "Why are your cheeks emaciated, your face sunken? Why is your heart so wretched, your features so haggard?" Utnapishtim sees Gilgamesh's divine heritage and sees it failing. Gilgamesh is aging, deteriorating, becoming fully mortal despite his goddess mother. Gilgamesh explains he's searching for eternal life, the life Utnapishtim possesses, and Utnapishtim's response is devastating. He doesn't say immortality is impossible. He says it's no longer available. He tells the flood story, but not as Gilgamesh expects. Utnapishtim didn't earn immortality through righteousness or wisdom. He was granted it by Ea as compensation after surviving a catastrophe the gods themselves regretted. Then Enlil, in a moment of remorse, granted Utnapishtim and his wife immortality and immediately exiled them to the distant edge of the world, beyond human reach. The message is clear. Immortality was a closed dispensation, a one-time exception. The mechanism that produced it no longer functions. Utnapishtim offers Gilgamesh a test. Stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights. If he can't even conquer sleep, how can he conquer death? Gilgamesh immediately falls asleep. When he wakes and protests that he only slept a moment, Utnapishtim's wife points to 7 loaves of bread she baked. 1 each day Gilgamesh slept, now in various stages of decay. The test seems arbitrary until you understand what it represents. Sleep in ancient Near Eastern thought was the little death, a daily surrender of consciousness. The antediluvian kings, if they truly lived for tens of thousands of years, would have had fundamentally different relationships with sleep, rest, and biological decay. Gilgamesh can't stay awake for a week because his biology is human. His divine heritage gives him strength, size, exceptional abilities, but it doesn't give him the fundamental physiological difference that separated the pre-flood rulers from post-flood humanity. Utnapishtim isn't testing Gilgamesh's worthiness. He's demonstrating biological incompatibility. The door isn't closed because Gilgamesh failed. The door is closed because the world beyond it no longer operates on principles that support beings like him. In an act of pity, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh about a plant that grows at the bottom of the cosmic ocean. A plant that restores youth, though not immortality. Gilgamesh dives down, finds it, and begins his journey home. He doesn't intend to use it himself immediately. He plans to bring it back to Uruk, test it on an elderly man, and only if it works will he use it to restore his own youth repeatedly. This is the mindset of someone who understands he's recovering lost technology. He's going to test it scientifically, verify it works, then implement it. But while Gilgamesh bathes in a pool, a serpent smells the plant's fragrance, emerges from the water, and eats it. The snake immediately sheds its skin and disappears, rejuvenated. Gilgamesh sits down and weeps. The text is explicit about why. Not because he fears death, but because the last possibility of reclaiming what his ancestors had is gone. The plant existed. It worked. The serpent proved it, but Gilgamesh will never possess it. When Gilgamesh returns to Uruk, the epic describes him showing his companion Urshanabi the city walls, the massive fortifications he built that still stood in historical times. The text shifts focus from what Gilgamesh couldn't achieve to what he did. He didn't restore the age of divine kings. He didn't reclaim immortality. He didn't reopen the antediluvian world. But he built. He governed. He left structures that outlasted his lifespan. The epic's conclusion is quietly radical. Human limitation can still produce permanence. Mortal hands can create works that transcend individual death. Gilgamesh's walls became legendary precisely because they were built by someone who accepted mortality and built anyway. The epic ends not with triumph, but with pragmatic adaptation. The old world is closed. The gods have withdrawn. Immortality is gone. What remains is the work itself. What makes the Epic of Gilgamesh more than mythology is that Gilgamesh was real, his city was real, and his construction projects were real. Later kings referenced him as a historical precedent. His walls were maintained for over 1,000 years. His name appears in king lists alongside verifiable historical rulers. This means the epic's central claim, that a semi-divine king in the early post-flood period sought to reclaim immortality, and was explicitly told it was no longer possible, was preserved as historical memory, not invented fantasy. The people who maintained this story for 3,000 years believed it described a real king confronting a real boundary. A boundary between an age when divine heritage meant something and an age when it didn't. If even the gods' descendants were denied the old world, what did humanity inherit instead? And if the answer is nothing but the responsibility to continue, why do all later civilizations structure themselves as if they're maintaining something rather than creating something new? The Stele of Hammurabi, carved around 1750 BC and now housed in the Louvre, shows the king standing before the seated god Shamash, receiving the symbols of justice. It's one of the most famous images from the ancient world, a king claiming divine authorization for his legal code. But look closely at what the image actually depicts. Hammurabi isn't a god. He's unmistakably human, standing below Shamash in a posture of reception. The god doesn't speak directly. He holds out the rod and ring, symbols of authority, which Hammurabi must take and interpret. This is kingship through mediation, authorized but not divine, legitimate but fundamentally human. The 282 laws inscribed below show something even more telling. They're enforced by human courts, administered by human officials, and designed to resolve human disputes without requiring divine intervention. The code never says Shamash declares or the gods command. It says, if a man does this, then this shall be done to him. Human authority operating within inherited frameworks, but without supernatural enforcement. This is what the world looks like after the gods stop ruling. Post-flood kingship required justification in ways earlier rulership apparently didn't. Kings commissioned inscriptions explaining why they deserved to rule. They built monuments proclaiming their legitimacy. They traced genealogies back to divine ancestors but never claimed to be divine themselves. Ur-Nammu's law code, predating Hammurabi by 3 centuries, begins with an elaborate preamble. After An and Enlil had turned over the kingship to Nana, at that time did Ur-Nammu, son born of Ninsun, for his beloved mother who bore him. The language is defensive. He's arguing for legitimacy, citing divine approval, emphasizing his lineage. The antediluvian kings needed no such arguments. They simply were. This shift from inherent authority to argued authority defines the post-flood political landscape across all ancient civilizations. What's historically curious is how much administrative structure survived the transition. Temple economies continued operating on systems established before the flood boundary. The distribution of grain rations, the organization of labor, the mathematical frameworks for taxation, all show continuity. Sumerian cities maintained administrative archives using accounting methods that appear fully formed in the earliest examples. Later dynasties didn't invent new systems. They maintained existing ones. Egyptian pharaohs ruled through nome structures, administrative divisions that Egyptian tradition explicitly traced to pre-dynastic times. The system was inherited, not designed. Chinese historical records describe the Xia dynasty receiving administrative principles from the legendary Yellow Emperor and sage kings. Later dynasties modified these principles, but treated them as ancient wisdom to be preserved. The pattern suggests early post-flood civilizations weren't inventing governance. They were maintaining it. After the initial burst of civilization around 3500 BC, development slows to a recognizably human pace. Bronze metallurgy improves gradually. Writing systems evolve incrementally. Architecture becomes more sophisticated through trial and error, spanning centuries. This is normal technological progression, each generation building on the previous one's discoveries. But it contrasts sharply with the appearance of base 60 mathematics, sophisticated urban planning, and complex astronomical knowledge that show no developmental precursors. If the same cultures could slowly develop bronze alloys over 1,000 years, why does their mathematical system appear complete? The pattern matches inheritance, followed by gradual loss of understanding, then slow redevelopment through human effort. Despite ruling independently, post-flood kings never stopped referencing the earlier age. Mesopotamian rulers called themselves shepherds, using terminology that appears in antediluvian contexts. Egyptian pharaohs claimed to restore the principles of Ma'at from the first time. Chinese emperors invoked the mandate of heaven as if replicating an earlier dispensation. The language of rulership remained anchored to a prior model that no longer functioned but was never forgotten. Even as kingship became increasingly human, based on military power, administrative competence, dynastic succession, the ideal remained divine rulership that had apparently existed before. Human history, as we recognize it, begins when humanity has to maintain civilization without those who established it. Kings rule but justify their rule. Laws function but require human enforcement. Progress continues but incrementally. The systems work, but like inherited machinery, no one fully understands anymore. Were humans finally free or simply left unsupervised? And if supervision ended at the flood, why does every subsequent civilization organize itself as if waiting for that supervision to return? In 1872, George Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist working in the British Museum, was cataloging fragments from Ashurbanipal's library when he came across tablet K3375. As he translated the cuneiform, he realized he was reading an account of a great flood with details strikingly similar to the biblical narrative, but written over 1,000 years earlier. His discovery shocked Victorian England. It meant the flood wasn't uniquely biblical. It was remembered across cultures, preserved in multiple independent traditions recorded by scribes who had no contact with Hebrew scripture. But Smith's discovery raised a question no one has satisfactorily answered. Why would completely separate civilizations preserve the same memory with such consistent detail? Either the flood was real and globally significant enough to be remembered everywhere, or every major culture independently invented the same false story about a catastrophe that divided history into before and after. The first option requires accepting that ancient chronologies preserve real boundaries. The second requires believing in statistically impossible coincidence. Neither explanation is comfortable. The evidence we've examined allows 3 possible readings, none of which can be definitively proven or dismissed. The first, these records are mythological, symbolic representations of social transitions, cosmic cycles, or the shift from oral tradition to written history. The gods are metaphors for early social order. Their departure represents humanity's psychological maturation from dependence to autonomy. This interpretation explains the symbolism but struggles with the specificity. Myths simplify. These records complicate. They preserve mathematical precision, genealogical detail, and chronological consistency across cultures that had no contact. The second interpretation. The texts preserve memories of a lost human civilization, a technologically advanced society that existed before the Younger Dryas catastrophe, was largely destroyed, and survived only in fragmentary records maintained by descendant cultures. This explains the sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge, but requires accepting that an entire advanced civilization vanished so completely that we found almost no physical evidence. It means rewriting the entire archaeological timeline of human development. The third interpretation is the one ancient texts themselves insist on. Non-human or semi-divine beings ruled early Earth, established civilization's foundational systems, and withdrew after a catastrophic boundary event, leaving humanity to maintain what they'd built. This interpretation takes the sources at face value, but requires accepting premises that violate modern assumptions about what's historically possible. All 3 explanations are uncomfortable. All 3 require abandoning some aspect of conventional understanding. What's undeniable, regardless of interpretation, is that ancient records describe something missing, a presence that once was and no longer is, an authority that functioned differently than human rulership, a biological possibility, extraordinary longevity that ended, a directness of divine communication that became mediation, knowledge that appeared complete, then required maintenance. The absence is consistent. The boundary is marked. The transition is remembered. Every major civilization structures its chronology around this absence. Every king list marks the boundary. Every flood narrative describes the withdrawal. Every legal code justifies human authority in terms of what was delegated, not originated. If the absence weren't real, if these were simply myths, why do they all describe loss rather than gain? The standard narrative of human history is progress, from primitive to advanced, from ignorance to knowledge, from barbarism to civilization. But the ancient records tell a different story. They describe civilization as something inherited and maintained, knowledge as something preserved rather than discovered, authority as something delegated then adapted to human limitations. If the records are even partially accurate, human history isn't the story of climbing upward from nothing. It's the story of learning to operate systems we didn't design, maintaining structures we didn't build, and adapting knowledge we don't fully understand. We didn't become civilized. We became the custodians of civilization. There's no dramatic conclusion to this investigation because the evidence doesn't allow one. The Sumerian king list still sits in the Ashmolean Museum. the lifespan collapses still appear in multiple independent chronologies. The flood boundary still marks the transition point in every major ancient tradition. The temples remain, but they're archaeological sites now. The rituals that once invoked divine presence are academic subjects. The gods who descended from heaven are mythology. But the absence they left, the gap between what the earliest records describe and what later history shows, remains unexplained. Human history may not be the story of becoming civilized. It may be the story of learning to live without those who once were. And if that's true, everything we call progress might simply be adaptation, the slow, painful process of learning to maintain alone what was once maintained for us. What if everything we call history is simply what happened after the gods?